Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Toya Minzy. I'm the social media manager for Ebony Magazine. And today we are going to be discussing Is Astrology Against My Religion? And we have Samuel F. Reynolds on the hangout today. And he's a former Baptist minister turned astrologer who has been doing charts and studying astrology for over 10 years. He currently consults, writes, and teaches astrology full time. So we have him on hand to answer any questions that you may have on astrology and does it mix well with your faith and spirituality. So say hello, Sam.
Hello, everyone.
Okay, so the first question that we have is what is astrology, Sam?
Astrology is the study of heavenly and planetary motion as a means of understanding what's happening on Earth. So the idea is that we look at the bodies above us as a means of understanding what's happening below us and coordinating our activities in relation to those particular things so that we kind of know what's going on. It's also very useful in getting perspective on terrestrial affairs when we can't see things pretty clearly.
Okay. Well, what does astrology have to do with spirituality and religion?
It has everything to do with both, but in different ways. And one could even argue that we have to wonder sometimes if spirituality has as much to do with religion. So the key thing between the two of them is understanding that astrology with spirituality is a way of connecting to something larger than ourselves and a way of embracing life, consciousness, in a way of looking for meaning and embracing, embodying meaning. So that's one of the key ways in which we connect literally to spirit in terms of expanding our consciousness and thus spirituality. In terms of religion, many of the world's religions often start off with that first sense of awe and wonder looking into the night sky and trying to understand, is there something larger? Are we alone? What is something in the cosmos that adores us, loves us, connects with us? And so many of the world's religions, especially the Abrahamic ones, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all kind of are rooted in some form or fashion with astrological theory or ideas. And we'll talk more about that, but some of the basis for which we understand the different strains of thought in those three religions, for example, are there. If we talk about other particular religions and traditions, we see that also in Buddhism and Hinduism. The Buddha actually, when he was a baby, or before he was even born, an astrologer came to his family and said that either he would become this great empire builder or he would become one of the greatest teachers the world's ever known. So astrology is even woven into the story of the Buddha. And then we also have the same stories in the Kemetic Egyptian stories, and we have the same thing in Hindu lore. So in terms of religion, one could argue that astrology is nature's Bible with a calendar. So that becomes the basis for how we understand other scriptures, other sacred texts in other religions.
Can astrology and religion mix together? Can you live be into astrology and still have faith in religion?
Yes, but I would say the key thing that we're talking about is having faith in God, or having faith in something larger than ourselves or the cosmos, because I'm particularly thinking about our Buddhist friends who are not so much about the idea of a deity, but the idea of embracing the all, or the idea of the Zen, that moment. So when we're talking about religion and astrology and having the basis for having both, there's a lot of different takes on it, but my particular take is that religion complements in so many ways, or I should say astrology complements religion in so many ways that we see evident, especially in Christianity, whether we're talking about the four Gospels and looking at how those are symbolized by the four fixed signs of the zodiac. So many times when people are in church, as an example, they may even see the Gospel of Luke as a bull, and they see the Gospel of Matthew as the actual angel, and then they see the Gospel of Mark as a lion, and then they see the Gospel of John as a Scorpio, as an eagle. All those things pertain to how astrology undergirds some of the ideas introduced even in the Bible. So astrology has a running course through not only Christianity, but one can also see it in terms of its mentioning in Islam, its mentioning in Judaism. Now the key thing is figuring out, well, how do faith and religion match together? And maybe that's something that we'll flesh out more as the evening progresses.
So what do religions say about astrology?
Well, most people, and I even saw this a little bit today online on Twitter. We didn't get so much activity on Facebook or on Google Plus. A lot of people think it's actually just either haram, that's from Islam, which says that it's forbidden, and also in Christianity they will say it's the devil's work. And one of the reasons why I wanted to be able to have this particular talk, since many of us, of African American persuasion, are very steeped in religions in some form or fashion, they're of that certain ilk and mindset to think that astrology is something that is forbidden. And I wanted to particularly address that. Is it something that should be forbidden? I think largely no, to be quite honest. And I think one of the ways in which it should not or is not really forbidden is that it permeates so much of our culture already. It's almost redundant to say, do I believe in astrology? For instance, let me ask you a question. What day is it?
Oh,
I put you on the spot.
it's Wednesday.
Wednesday, right? It's Woden's day. All right. If we were speaking Spanish, we would say miércoles, right? So that's Mercury's day. If we were talking about tomorrow, it's Thor's day, which also relates to Jueves or Jove's day. Friday, Viernes, Venus's day. Saturn is still in English, and we still use it, so it's Saturday. So the ideas of astrology permeate so much of our culture already. So it's almost, like I said, redundant or almost useless to say, like, oh, well, do you believe in it? It's already kind of embedded into how we practice even our organization of time. The question is, how much credence or faith can we give to astrology? And this is where I actually differ with some people. I would say that the key thing is to have faith in God. And astrology, the planets, the signs, these different things, they show us the signs by which we can understand more about ourselves and more about the handiwork of God. So I think faith is the key thing to have, but the question is what to have faith in. And I think one thing, just to kind of go back, is that astrology, like other forms of tradition, religion, because we have to be honest that the Christianity that has crystallized now, for instance, in all its different array of forms, is not the same Christianity of the 2nd century, the 3rd century, or the same thing with Islam from the 8th century, the 7th century. So all these different things evolve. Astrology had the same thing. So the early aspects of astrology was very much about worshiping particular deities or when to make particular sacrifices in order to appease that. But astrology has morphed, and so there's become, in many different traditions, some of it fused through Islam, some of it fused through Christianity, some of it fused through Neoplatonic thought, is really being undergirded by a belief in the one, and that there are different ways of understanding that one in the principles of astrology, but not worshiping like Mercury or Venus or those different things. Now, that can become a distraction for someone of faith, where they're focused on appeasing these particular deities or understanding, like, well, I want to make sure everything's in alignment for me as a Scorpio, and they lose focus in relation to how that relates to their relationship with the divine. So the key thing is how one relates to the divine, and I think that's the key focus that we should have.
Well, what do religions say about the observations of the heavens?
Well, among them, all of them affirm the legitimacy of you can either say astronomy or astrology. And one kind of little nerdish point to make: astronomy is the outgrowth of astrology, and it became the de-meaningful aspect, or derationalized way or rationalized way of understanding the heavens without assigning meaning to them. But astrology and astronomy were seen as pretty much the same thing for most of human history. And so in the observations of the heavens, one definitively talked about the handiwork of God. In fact, I'm quoting Psalm 19 in terms of talking about the idea of God. And if we look at one of the oldest books in the Bible, Job, we see at the very end of the book that God talks about how he made the Pleiades and how he creates the arc of heaven and the expanse of everything that we know in terms of the constellations. And even in the Quran, there's a whole surah dedicated to understanding the constellations and paying attention to the signs. So these particular ways by which we look at the meaning of the heavens, but also paying attention to the scope of them, whether they're constellations or the sun and the moon, are throughout all of the scripture. I mean, if you go to Genesis 1, right in Genesis 1, it talks about that the sun, moon, and earth would be as a sign or signs, and that the creation of the very cosmos, of the very world, in 7 days, kind of mentioning that idea again, since we have these 7 days, relate very much to the idea that the heavens become a way by which we come to see the invisible. They are the visible manifestation of the invisible that is what we usually describe as God. That's even scripture. In fact, I like to quote that particular scripture since I think it's so beautifully said. This is from the Bible, the Christian Bible, Romans 1:20. It says, "For since the creation of the world's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse."
Okay. So what is true?
Yeah, which is the truth between whether we're talking about astrology as an observation or we're talking about the idea of meaning? I would say a couple things are true. One, I think astrology generally is true both in its observational sense and its meaningful sense. But I want to talk about some particular caveats and ways in which astrology may not ring true for people, and maybe with just cause. Among them is anything that distracts a person, whether it's a horoscope or whether it's a reading or their own reading in terms of a chart, from their understanding of them or their divine self, of a self that is formless and shapeless and eternal. Anything that distracts them from understanding that and appreciating that is something that can compromise faith. So if one gets too much into the material dimensions of prediction and wanting to understand from one particular point of view what a planet is saying or what a sign is saying, I think that's when we're going toward a level of falsehood in terms of what astrology can best do. So when astrologers purport to know your future better than you do, or can speak with such definitive certainty about things, then we run the risk, a very profound risk, of a compromise of understanding faith. And faith is kind of being able to appreciate the invisible when one is not quite dealing with the visible. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. So when we get too reliant on astrology as a concrete means of talking about both our inner life spiritually and then so much about our external life without attentiveness to our meditations, our prayers, our understandings, our knowledge, then that's when we get into a level of misapprehension in terms of appreciating astrology. So there are levels of control that people often want in their lives that sometimes goes toward the abuse of astrology. So for instance, you want to meet a mate, And so it becomes so much about looking at the intricacies of every chart or every person who comes in your, purview, looking at that person's chart and kind of always attempting kind of figure out how you really match and whether this is a good match, even maybe before you even met the person, before you even said boo. And that doesn't allow for even the manifestation. Let's say there is no God. Let's go for a second with that. That doesn't even allow for the fertile ground of love, you know. And so that's one key abuse that I often see in terms of astrology. So, like I said, there are many other ways in which one can abuse it, but that's one. Those are some of the key ways in which I see people shy away or stray away from dimensions of faith.
So, is there room for faith in astrology?
Yes. I think, one of the things I can say is that that's been my journey, is that, just briefly, as you mentioned, I was a Baptist minister, and then I had a dissolution of my faith for a number of reasons. I went into the ministry when I was 12 years old, and I stayed in it till I was 19, and I started having some questions to which many of my elders couldn't answer readily. And then eventually I came to realize that I didn't belong in the church, and then eventually I moved away from Christianity, and then I moved away from God. But what brought me back was studying the mystical and spiritual and profound, often visible manifestations of workings of astrology. On top of looking at other things, like I study Kabbalah, and I also study some tarot and numerology, and all of them seem to kind of point to some ultra meaning in terms of how the cosmos works. Much like how we see the source code on the HTML, or we see the source code when we're looking at the matrix. So astrology became a way of understanding that there was a source code, and it made me want to look for the source. So I became a lot more focused on wanting to understand the source. And that's where I think astrology has the most promise in making room for faith, because at some point then you realize where you're going beyond the limits of faith and then going into either faithlessness or wanting to have more and more levels of human control.
Got it. So I'm just reading on our Facebook page, and someone is sort of disputing this because they're saying that they're Christian and that the Bible says that stars were given for signs and seasons and calculating distance and time. And that was from Genesis. And she feels that when people get into predicting and interpreting futures using stars, they have crossed the line into stargazing, astrology, which God forbids and condemns. What do you have to say to that?
I would say that there's a general interesting meme that runs through most of religious discourse from pretty much the medieval period until now, and it goes along a similar strain as this woman is talking about. And it's the idea that we can't really predict, and we can't use these things to predict. And I know this is also a strain of thought in Islam, that we can't predict what we attempt to do, which is interesting to me, considering that if people heard me as a weatherman, as a meteorologist, which was a branch of astrology, if they heard me as a meteorologist and I said that there was a 90% chance of rain, 5 will get me 10. If I were a betting man, they would come out with umbrellas. So the question of prediction either is that one can't predict with certainty, which is true. No man, no woman can predict with certainty. However, I think it's equally false to say that we can't use these things to predict, and that is what God has forbidden, because that's why we have a time for things. There's a reason why a farmer will go out at a particular time to plant things per the same calendar we use for astrology. In fact, one can even say that the calendar for astrology is the same calendar for how we use the calendrical seasons. In fact, that's really the basis of it. The tropical zodiac, which is what we call our Western zodiac, is based on the start of seasons in the West and for the Northern Hemisphere. So it sounds like this person is saying that, oh, we can refrain from all levels of prediction and that they're only used for distance and these particular things, where a farmer or a fisher person unfortunately makes her a liar every time they plant or every time they fish.
Okay, and then another comment that was left from Keisha was that she is saying that astrology has always existed long before religion. Now, is there some truth to that?
Absolutely. So the idea, but it's an interesting moment, too. So I want to kind of, because I think two things happen that I've seen when we kind of get into this discussion. One thing is to say that astrology has always existed before religion, and that is largely historically, anthropologically true, that many cultures have developed their own way of assigning meaning to what happens in the stars. However, religion is the crystallization of a community around a revelation. And so a revelation may not necessarily be just something that directly comes from one's studies of astrology, but what's fascinating is that it often may parallel. So the story of the sun, with its 12 signs, has brilliant analogies to what happens with Joseph and his 11 brothers, as an example, or being the 12 sons of Jacob, or of Isaac. So these particular things, in terms of how they relate to, or even the 12 disciples related to Christ, they parallel in many ways the same story of astrology, but that does not mean that the story of Christ is just only the story of astrology. There is a specific way in which we understand the message for Christians of Christ, or the message of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his particular message to his people. All these particular ways become a way of understanding the message that's even embedded in the stars. Not a way to say that they're only messages that are culled from the stars. God writes everywhere.
Okay. So let's see So if anybody that's watching now has any questions.
Yeah, I see two questions on the side here.
You do? I see nothing. Okay. Do you want to read the questions then, Sam?
Yeah, I see one from Lenny that says, are we to assume that someone who claims to be a spiritual advisor is also a practicing Christian? That's one question. Does Sam consider himself a spiritual advisor? Okay. First question, are we to assume that someone who claims to be a spiritual advisor is also a practicing Christian? No. One should not assume that, because, if you want to know in terms of that nomenclature, spiritual advisor, they could be Christian, but they could be an amalgam of many other things that may not be your understanding of Christianity. So that is important to know. Would I consider myself a spiritual advisor? I think I do speak to people's spirits and souls, but that's not usually a title I bestow upon myself. There's a very clear reason why. I think the clearest reason is that I study astrology, Kabbalah, basically this form of thought that's called Hermetic. It is a Hermetic sensibility by which we understand ideas that date back even to before ancient Egypt in terms of particular principles. So I use some of these ideas as related to astrology. So I focus in on a particular way that I'm merely talking mostly about the chart in relation to the person. I would think a spiritual person is doing a similar thing if they're doing according to something with dogma, but I think more so it would be talking to the person just as the person. I'm not a counselor. I don't have training as a counselor and as an advisor and being responsible for people's souls. That's not something, or spirits, that's not something I've put on myself, although some have assigned that to me, but I wouldn't call myself a spiritual advisor.
Okay. And well, there's another question here from Nicole D.
Yes.
Collier.
Collier.
Collier. She says that some people describe astrology as magic, but your commentary about astronomy leads her to believe it's more of a practice of observation. Can you speak more about the role and purpose of the astrologer?
Yes. So astronomy is literally the practice of observation of the heavens and measure in order to understand motion. Astrology is a little different, and this is where I think Nicole is being very perceptive in understanding something else that does wig out some people of religious faith. There is a delicate moment that astrology can seem to dance into the realm of magic. There's also a delicate moment where we can talk about Jesus dancing into the realm of magic, where how are you able to kind of defy natural order of things to know, to see, accomplish particular things. And magic basically is the idea where you can tap into certain underlying principles to effect change a particular way that either could quote unquote be unnatural or in a way that is not usual. Now, I think the key thing is realizing that if that's true, are we performing magic when we're doing prayer? Are we performing magic when you kind of defy the expectations of your doctor or a particular way by using a certain level of thought and focus and will? And so, there is kind of this moment where you're kind of doing, or you could be doing astrological magic, which I'll explain in a second, where you're seeking to touch base with powerful forces or the idea of particular spirits in order to affect a particular thing. For instance, whether you're talking about using the Psalms a particular way. I mean, one tradition that is actually very much in African American culture, and some people know what I'm talking about. The Power of Psalms is one book such like this, where you can even do recitations of the Psalms and do them a particular way on a particular day in order to kind of have something manifest. That technically is magic. So, the question is, can one use magic to do anything? Yeah, and the thing is, if you have an aversion to doing magic, like whether it's astrological or using the Psalms or using numbers or a particular way, then this probably wouldn't be the thing for you. But there is a realm of astrology that does go beyond just observation into attempting to work something for your benefit. I hope that answers Nicole's question.
Okay, and then we had another comment from someone on Twitter. Milton Harris says that, well, it's kind of hard to believe you can do all things through Christ, but only on certain days.
I don't think anyone's saying that. The God of astrology is the God of all in that sense. When I say the God of all, if you believe in the power of Christ, I don't believe in the supremacy of Christ because I'm a Muslim. But if you believe in the supremacy of Christ, then as God, then God trumps all days. One of the problems that astrology does have is that if we're talking about purely on a dimension of soul, especially in terms of what happens when we die, whether you're a Christian, a Muslim, or a Hindu who believes in reincarnation, all that goes out the window when you die. No one's going to be looking at your transits for what happens with your soul as a consciousness after you die. No one knows for sure. So all these things are trumped by our life eternal. So I'm not saying that Christ is only kind of condensed into what can happen on particular days, because if Christ is God, then God can do all things. I'm saying that we're talking about working with things in the temporal realm and understanding things from our limited human consciousness. We're understanding them from a particular point of reference that even God has kind of made some measure of allusion to. For instance, God can do all things. Now, this is an interesting kind of point of contention between Muslims and Christians, which I'm not trying to, open up, but it's just an interesting point. So, according to Christian lore in the book of Genesis, God rested on the seventh day. According to Muslims, God never needs to rest. So, when God rests on the seventh day, because God wanted to rest and also give us a day of rest, does that mean then, by virtue of that quote-unquote seventh day, that God couldn't even get beyond, the seventh day as a day of rest because, that's what he did? No, he did it, or she did it, because that's what God wanted to do. So God trumps all days. So I don't think we have to constrain ourselves by days.
Okay, and then we have another question from Lenny Washington. She said that she thought terms like spiritual advisor meant that astrology was safe for her to associate with. Mm-hmm. However, she's curious to know if it's really against her religion. Since she's still single and she has a strong tendency to rely heavily upon astrology when it comes to dating, she's very mindful to consider a man's zodiac sign and deacon before she agrees to go out with him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw that earlier. I was wondering if she was going to ask that. My answer to her on that level is that astrology is not against her religion, but it could be crippling her faith. And what I mean by that is when you focus on one part of astrology as becoming a totalizing truth for understanding a person, you could be on the brink of committing quote-unquote a sin. And not necessarily just against quote-unquote God, but also against your brother or your sister. So if I said to you, well, Toya, you're a Pisces, so I don't know if we can, work together on this particular project because you're a Pisces, and when I actually have dealt with Pisceans, even though I'm a Pisces rising, I usually have had problems. Now, none of that's true. But if I went with that idea by my own limited understanding, I would be missing the whole complexity of you in terms of understanding you. So, one of the things that an astrologer does is that he relates or she relates to a commentary on a person based on that person's chart. That does not mean that becomes the way by which we navigate all relationships or dealings with that person, because a person may have gotten a certain level of consciousness beyond his or her chart, in terms of understanding things. And I had a bad temper. I still have a challenging temper. This is actually real fact. So that actually is highlighted in my chart. Now, I've done a lot of work with my temper. So if someone looked at my chart and, we have two astrologers, let's say women, girl, that man got a temper. He might throw some, hot grease on you or whatever. That would be a way of pigeonholing me without really looking at me as a person. So I think the key thing is realizing that you are just getting the faintest of pictures from stars. But in order to kind of really know and get like a, more than the grainy image of a person, you have to get to know a person. So be mindful of how much you know. Be mindful of how much you know in relation to how you use astrology. Because it's great to use the decans, but I have to ask her, and I wanted to ask her, like, which decans do you use? There are like 3. And when I say 3, there's the Western, there's the Indian, and there's the medieval.
Wow. There's so much to learn with the astrology.
I know.
So many, the whole decans, the rising sun. Wow.
Right.
That would be for another Google Hangout.
Yes.
So once again on Twitter, we did have someone also wanted to know what does the Bible say about astrology?
The Bible says a number of things about astrology, from Deuteronomy, talking about the idea of fortune telling, It says a number of things in terms of the idea of astrologers leading people astray. That's also mentioned in Isaiah. And here's some context for people who study the Bible in understanding it. As I said, there's an evolution in terms of astrology. And so some aspect of the early aspect of astrology was very much into what we call asterisms, looking at particular clusters of planets and then looking at them in relation to particular gods and certain sacrifices. So there was actually an astral religion that many people focused on. So in the time of Israel, there may have been a great number of people who still worshipped these particular deities or appear to worship these particular deities. So there were very strong cautions against anything that distracted people from understanding the idea of the unseen God. And I think some measure of astrology has also evolved in acknowledging and detailing the idea of the unseen God. The first transformation of this was Abraham. Abraham himself came from the land of Ur, which is Chaldea. Chaldea, Babylonia, is known for the creation of astrology. So it's believed that the first patriarch of Judaism, of Christianity, and of Islam was probably an astrologer himself. It's no accident that God says to him to count the stars, and that will be as innumerable as your progeny. And that's because most likely Abraham knew the stars. So when we say like, oh, well, astrology, well, the Bible forbids astrology, you have to be able to look at it at the context. And I also remind Christians, if astrology is forbidden, why is it in, I think, 3 of the Gospels, the story of 3 wise men, magi, coming to find Jesus by a star?
Wow, interesting point. So we have Yukio. She just asked a question on Google Plus. How does astrology make predictions without accounting for environmental influences in the lives of people?
A good astrologer does not do that. A good astrologer does not account for some measure of the environmental aspect of the person. One thing you've seen me emphasize during this whole particular talk is a focus on the personhood of the person using astrology. So it is not something that is completely detached like any other form of study or analysis from the context of the person. So it is important to look at the context of talking about, let's say, love in relation to a person's sexual orientation. I do not believe astrology can talk or detail someone's sexual orientation just from a chart. But it does become a different conversation from looking at planetary signatures for how we talk about men and how we talk about women and how one talks about looking for men or women. So if I saw in a woman's chart that she had a lot of masculine energy or a lot of masculine signatures in her chart, in a patriarchal society that we live in, and for men or for a particular woman who's interested in being with a man, she will have to recognize that there's a lot of assertiveness that she may have that may not complement all forms of men. So she has to have a certain awareness for how her chart, how herself will blend with particular kinds of men and what kind of men would be more suitable for her. And that's not a question of sign. That's also a question of awareness in terms of actual encounter with people. So one always takes into particular context what happens within a person's chart. If you see a solid indicator for someone being able to have money, it's one thing for that person to have been born into a family that's mostly thousandaires, and there's another thing for that person to have been born into a family that's millionaires. So there's a different scope by which one understands the chart in context to a person.
Well, should people put their faith in astrology as a fact?
As a fact, or
I mean, should they should they believe, really believe in astrology?
I believe that they should believe in it as much as they use any tool. You know, do I believe in Google? As much as Google is useful. Um, do I believe in the Bible? Do I believe in the Quran? Yes, I believe in the Quran as much as it directs me toward my understanding of the divine. The key thing is really having a very prime focus on the spirit. And that's not something that is manifested in any single text. It's something that is written and beholden and beholds us from everywhere. So I think that's the key aspect of quote unquote belief or dimension of faith. But we can use astrology as a useful means by appreciating how we have an interpenetration between what happens from the realm of spirit and to what happens on the physical realm.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to wrap up today's Google
What's so
Hangout.
fast? It's
I
over.
know it was it was 45 minutes.
Wow, that was fun.
Yeah, it was fun. We had a lot of great questions, and thank you to our followers and readers that asked really good questions. And thank you, Sam, for joining us. I know that you do chart reads. Do you want to tell
Yeah,
our audience a little bit about that?
yeah. So there's a couple different ways to reach me. Let me tell you my website. The key way to reach me is to go to unlockastrology.com. And then if you would like to email me, it's unlockastrology@gmail.com. And you also can find me on Twitter. So that's S as in Sam, F as in Fred, Reynolds, all one word, SF Reynolds. That's my Twitter handle. And then you also can find me on Twitter under Unlock Astrology. And of course, we have our monthly chats where I talk. We have Ebony Zodiac, so we'll be doing Gemini, I guess, next week, inshallah. So
Yes. So
that's another way to reach me.
follow the Ebony Zodiac hashtag for that.
Right, and the key thing also, for those who are interested in a full session with me, would like to talk more, have their chart read, is that if you read Ebony magazine, especially online, and you read our horoscopes, you have a discount, and that discount is right on there. So be sure when you connect with me that you mention that, or actually click that button.
And also, if you follow the Ebony Zodiac hashtag on Twitter, we do break down Sam's weekly horoscope reads with the tweet, and then you can read the rest, of course, with the link that's attached. So thank you everyone for joining us. If you want to watch this again, it'll be on our YouTube channel, and it'll be here as well on Google+. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Toy. Bye.